Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Better Buildings for Humans podcast. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and this is the show where we look at the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and our general joy of being alive. And of course, we talk about sustainability, we talk about beauty and art as well. Of course, you do in architecture. So anyway, this week I want to introduce you to Isun Kazerani. Isun, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, this is going to be wonderful. Before we get started, Isun is an architect, PhD architect, and we're going to talk a little bit about you first. Before we do anything else, we're going to talk about you. I want you to tell us about, why you chose architecture as a career. I always love asking that question. And then talk about the kind of work you've done so far, including your PhD thesis, please. And then tell us about what you're doing these days.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. Again, thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited about this session because I've had a look at your previous sessions and they looked very exciting and very insightful. So, hi, I am originally from Australia, Persian background. I used to have my firm in Australia. I still have it, a motion studio based in Melbourne. Started up in 2018-19, officially in 2019. And I moved to the US in 2023 after COVID, due to all the complexities that we had in Melbourne, which we had the longest lockdown in the entire world. And yeah, I've been practicing here ever since. In terms of why I chose architecture, it's a very good question. I think I always knew. I want to give you a little bit of a background about, my family and where I come from. I come from a family where there was a lot of focus on education and, just trying to understand what type of talents and what type of capabilities that we had. And I'm very grateful. That comes from my parents. My mom is a Persian literature teacher and my dad's a businessman. So a very good combination. And they were very keen in training us in all possible fields. So I did a lot of different classes, aside from a very strict type of school system, from drawing to painting to different types of athletic programs. So I did different types of sports, basketball, running, tennis. And I also did obviously a lot of focus on mathematics and physics and, science at school, and also continuous training in painting and drawings. And I always knew that I loved the combination of the two, the scientific and the artistic. And I always knew that architecture is the best form of this combination. So since I was, I think, maybe 14, I knew that I wanted to do architecture. I had a lot of interest in mathematics always and physics. I love solving problems. So again, architecture was the best, example, particularly that it also deals with geometry and a lot with physics as well. And in terms of my PhD, and types of projects that I've done, pretty much everything. As a female firm owner, almost COVID startup, I really had to say yes to all different types of projects. Very competitive, but I started with multifamily and retail, as well as hospitality typologies. Later on, because of COVID, I had to scale down to a lot of private residences and villas, as well as education and also hospitals and health department as well. For my PhD, I think my PhD was, the most insightful period of my entire career, I have to say. I had the opportunity, very lucky and very grateful from University of Melbourne that I got a scholarship to work with 4 amazing international architects on really interesting projects. They were public civic spaces and a combination of architecture and landscape architecture. I was very keen to understand what type of design strategies they have taken on. And I sort of classified the design strategies from minimal intervention to what I call additive strategies. So where architects on one end of the spectrum, like when they approach a site, and usually with all the potentials of the site, they approach it with a lot of consideration and attention and detailing, and they try to excavate the site and understand what it is, to the strategies, and they don't do much intervention, just minimal intervention on the site, to strategies where they add a lot of objects to the site. So minimal to additive, and then in the middle we had like a more of a mixed strategy. Anyhow, and then I was also interested to see how human experience is shaped by different design strategies, sensory experience. That was my thesis, and I think my passion for starting up my own firm started right after or during my PhD, because I saw these amazing firms, including in New York, in Copenhagen, and in Barcelona, in Sydney, Australia. And I started from there. And in terms of, I think the other question, what I'm doing these days, very good question. I'm doing, I think, too many things at the moment. I recently accepted an offer for a principal position at the moment, associate principal, because I'm still getting licensed in the US at a firm in Minneapolis. And it's a very interesting type of context because they also, it's supposed to be an integration of engineering and architecture, which I really like because I come from an architecture engineering background. I think the combination of structural engineering and architecture could enhance, the technology of, sustainability and green design as well, which is very exciting. And yeah, other than that, I'm also doing my normal things such as my writings. I've been writing a book about my adventures with architecture and motion studio, my firm. Also, I've continued my mentoring practice. I'm also trying to collaborate with AIA here in Minneapolis and Minnesota. Really lovely and friendly and welcoming people. So a lot of things at the moment. I think until I settle in the new climate of this state, I think I'm going to be busy for a while.
It sounds like it.
What makes a home truly extraordinary? Not just how it looks, but how it feels. Solera Reserve transforms daylight into soft, comfortable light, privacy without blinds, beauty without compromise. By day, refined and luminous. By night, an unforgettable glow. Solera Reserve, luxury glass, designed for living. Learn more at advancedglazings.com/Solera Reserve.
Well, listen, we're going to do something really interesting today. This is going to be a very unique episode, going somewhere we've never gone. We're going to explore some ways in which architecture reaches beyond architecture. My son and I had a good conversation prior to recording a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about what, some of the things we'd want to talk about. And one of the things that came up was the idea that there's connection between architecture and fashion, right? Now, fashion and architecture, they both shape how we move, how we feel, and probably most importantly, how we express identity. One at scale of just us humans, and then the other on the scale of spaces. Let me start by asking, where do you see the strongest overlap between architecture and fashion in terms of our human experience?
Very good question. Well, my interest in fashion, just again, give you a little bit of a background, because it's been a question that I've always been asked. My passion for, I think, fashion comes from, it's a little bit in our DNA. My mom is a very talented artist, in my opinion, way more talented than I am. And since we were kids, she is very talented in like handcrafts, so in sewing and, doing things that are involved with hands. And she taught at school and high school and secondary school. But whenever she had free time, she made clothes for us. So very special occasions, we used to wear our mom's type of outfits, me and my brother both. So I was very lucky to be able to see the process of how a piece of, garment is, the fabric is being selected and also designed and made into a wearable type of structure. And I always had that passion. And I still have it in a way that I need to. It is a very important element in representing my identity, I suppose. So I need to be very conscious about what I wear to be able to make sure that I am presenting who I am. And I think I continued on this interest. There were ideas for me to start a fashion business after I finished my master's. I started doing business management degree, but then I got a scholarship in architecture. And I knew that I think architecture is just really the priority for me. Anyhow, I continued on my PhD in architecture, but the good thing was that I had the opportunity to run two fashion and architecture studios, Master of Architecture with my students. I'd worked with fashion designers in designing runways, international fashion designers, very conceptual at a concept level design. And then I designed these, and in answer to your question, I designed the brief of these studios on the whole idea of the relationship between fashion and architecture as two multi-scalar type of structures, which one embodies, human people, and the other one embodies, our physical body. It was a very interesting studio. I mean, both of them were very interesting. We were also very interested in how the connotation of cultural and social type of complexities on fashion and how we represent ourselves. What we did was that we first started doing a lot of social cultural type of analysis, and we designed all these garments with students. So for example, we were trying to understand how each of us coming from different cultures would look at fashion and how people would view fashion. They went and did a lot of interviews with people in shopping malls, and they created their type of fashion, their garment. And then they experimented with performing in those garments and then see how these performances will inform designing a retail architecture. I think what I find very interesting is a similarity between, form, material, texture, between architecture and fashion. But again, I think architecture obviously goes beyond that, because we need to be also very much conscious of how an architecture structure would impact the way people live, it will impact the culture, impact the politics, impact social life of people. So I see a lot of similarity, but I think for me, fashion is a very interesting, could be a creative type of practice, but it came to an end for me, at least for me, at a certain point, because I couldn't see how this could be continued and be challenging enough for me to really pursue. And I still love fashion. We had amazing exploration with my students, my master's students at Melbourne Uni in 2015 and 2019. But I think the reason why I'm not necessarily continuing on my fashion type of, or I will maybe after 10 years or so, is that I think the fashion industry at the moment is impacted a lot by a lot of things such as celebrity culture, fast fashion.
Fast fashion? What is fast fashion?
That's a very good question. I just explained about the celebrity part, and then we
Sure.
talk about fast fashion.
Okay.
We had that in our previous conversation. I think the way people look at fashion with this belief system that we can just design and make things and sell it with no really education or with no really knowledge about the history and where it comes from and how it's evolved and how it's going to impact people's lives, particularly women's lives. I think that's a discussion that is, in my opinion, is missing. Also, the other thing is that I don't necessarily enjoy watching how the whole celebrity side of fashion is glorified. This whole event such as Met Gala and how they are impacting fashion and how they are, again, glorifying that image of fashion that only for certain people and comes in only certain forms. What I would love to see is how fashion will be performed in everyday type of lives of normal people, everyday people, and how it transforms through time. That's what I'm very interested to see, because that brings in a lot of creativity from people who don't necessarily spend a lot of money on making fashion. And I think with the least type of facilities, you usually become the most creative. So I think that's the thing that I don't necessarily love about the current culture and where the industry is going, because I can see less technical type of design, less focus on, structure and the techniques of representing fashion. And obviously fast fashion, we talked about this and how we see the, for example, how fast is fashion and how fast is architecture. I'm usually very fast in architecture. You have to have a fast speed if you've practiced in New York, which I have. And it was a bit of a, shock to me compared to how we did it in Australia. Obviously fast fashion, we see how everything is copied a lot. We have few fashion designers who design with a lot of awareness about human body and about culture. Giorgio Armani, for example, was one of them. Valentino was one of them. They were also very conscious and very interested in architecture as well. Architecture side of things, and they had a lot of knowledge about architecture. But I think one of the connotation of fast fashion is that everyone copies styles and trends, and regardless of the intention behind that design, things are copied with different types of qualities, from the most expensive to the, cheapest type of quality. And, obviously they have different users, but majority of the time you look at, you go out, for example, on a weekend and even to parties and stuff, people look very much alike, very similar. Right. So I think that's one of the connotation. So yeah, but I think architecture cannot be fast. And I think the slower the architecture is, the better, particularly when it comes to design.
Interesting. So the learnings from fashion and the what not to do's in fashion, can they be translated to architecture?
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that I should say about our learnings from, those studios that I did with my very intelligent master's students, very talented, was how the design of retail shops could be impacted by architects understanding, the culture, the history of fashion, also how people perform in a retail shop, like what are different elements in perception of garments in a retail shop, in terms of we brought in the technology of AR and how, there's this new technology where you can watch yourself in front of a mirror and then try on different types of garments, or in a sense where you can actually try on that piece of fashion, whatever it is. So I think that sensory experience, that the type of performance that you can do by trying on that garment in the retail shop and how it will impact the way you decide is also about whether I'm going to buy that or not, is also, I think that was something that very insightful type of outcome of those studios, which I think retail architects should definitely take into consideration. I mean, one thing that in terms of what we learned about fashion, I think just understanding human experience and how, obviously culture and politics and sensory experience impacts fashion and obviously the experience of fashion. I think that's something that we definitely need to consider in architecture as well.
I'm going to make a statement, and then I'm going to ask you to comment on that statement. So you just triggered an interesting idea for me. So fashion, planned obsolescence is absolute key component for the fashion industry, right? You can't wear last year's fashion. That was last year's. That kind of approach could be very problematic in architecture, right? You build a building in 2026 and by 2030, it's out of style, or a home is way out of style, those sorts of things. So there has to be more of a universality in architecture, a timelessness in architecture compared to fashion. How do you feel about that statement?
Great question. Very good question. And maybe that's an experience that I've had since I moved to the US, because I moved a few times because of work. And I moved here with 2 suitcases and my pet rabbit and a carry-on luggage. I had to keep exact same, volume in terms of my belongings and whatever I have in terms of my clothing. And for 3 years, I barely shopped. I barely bought anything for 3 years. And that was very tough for me as someone who's always been very interested in fashion. And I was never a big shopper, but I cared a lot about, obviously what I wear and everything else. So I really had to learn how to just be very self-sufficient and also be able to be content with the minimum type of options, which was a big learning. And I think it has helped me a lot in also being able to, in terms of communicating my identity with other people, because I would have looked a little too over the top as an architect back in Australia, because of my older fashion interests. But I think here I just had to really, reduce the complexity of what I wear and just be as simplified in terms of number, in terms of, the decoration and everything else that I use, accessories and everything else. I think, and that's a very good question, you learn a lot by doing that, because then you value what you have way more, because, that's what you have. So you got to look after it. In terms of architecture, and that's something that, we value aged architecture, aged buildings a lot, if it's built well. And, we renovate it and we try to repair it. We try not to throw it out, or we try not to demolish it unless we have to. And and it's the same thing with fashion. I wish we had the same type of approach. We had more handcrafted type of works that we could just repair and reuse. In architecture, I think that's the good thing about it, because yeah, like we respect aged type of buildings, and we try to actually connect to where it came from. So, history becomes very important. And yeah, I think that's the difference between the two. And I think the timelessness, and, majority of the times we know that buildings would age longer than us. So they become sometimes more important than us because, more people are living and using the building. So that's a very good point that you raised, definitely.
Yeah, it's interesting. You remind me of another guest. I had Eric Corey Fried from Canon Design on the show a couple of times now, actually. And Eric, we talked about regenerative design, which I know is a passion of yours as well.
Yeah.
And one of the ideas was that, as an example, we know that people are going to want to renovate their kitchen every 15 or 20 years, right? We're talking residences. So why not build things in such a way that it's easy to take out the cabinets, right? Instead of having to tear the walls to pieces, right? And you can see how that could be extrapolated to other things. So when taste and style changes in a building, it's relatively easy to modify the facade to meet modern tastes. It's relatively easy to modify the interiors to meet those modern tastes and plan with the assumption that style is going to change and it's going to be easy to, and make it such that making those changes is just a simpler, less destructive process, right? So yeah, it was really interesting, that part of the conversation. I want to change gears completely because I want to make sure we cover this topic. You expressed the idea that architects can and should use their power, right? That architects have an opportunity to assert themselves politically. And I've had, Pascal Sablan on the show and others who've talked about how architecture, can shape equity and behavior in very powerful ways. What do you think are the areas where architects have the greatest opportunity and maybe even the greatest responsibility to act as agents of political change?
That's a very good question. It's one of my passions, actually. I was a guest at another podcast. It was the first time I said yes to a non-architecture type of podcast. It was about business and, wealth, and I tried to focus on female business owners a lot. And I was explaining that, look, what I really love about our works is that we focus a lot on work, on architecture, rather than on us. So on like all the websites and, on Instagram and all social media, we see a lot of architecture. So less is about, and I love it because I don't necessarily love this whole idea of entrepreneur and how you become a tool of marketing for whatever business you're doing. And that's why I don't find myself an entrepreneur. I think, and this is amazing. So as architects, we know, unless you really love architecture, I think the chances that you can survive long-term and make good architecture are not that high. We know that what we do and the way we have to be qualified is very similar to, I would compare it to a medical doctor or to an attorney. Sometimes really way more complex than that because there's so many responsibilities. We do have to do all these licensing type of procedures. But at the same time, I feel, and we love architecture, we talk about architecture between us a lot, and I think we all enjoy the conversations. I think what we should do more is talk about architecture in everyday type of language to everyone else, to people, and to be able to sort of, talk about, okay, so I have designed this building. What are the consequences of this multifamily or this retail shop or this apartment, this house, in terms of like culturally, socially, and politically? I think that is not being done. As much as I love the fact that we present our works a lot rather than us, but at the same time, I feel like there's a lot of knowledge and there's a lot of capacity and potential among us, between us, that can contribute to cultural and political type of progress in society, that we don't do that. We don't talk about, hey, like I designed this multifamily for these reasons. I really wanted to bring all different cultures together, and then this is how it's happening. Or I designed this public space because I was thinking about this is how it's going to politically make people question about, certain things. And politicians might look at this and say, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So let's have a conversation with people about this, whole question. I think that is something that has been less discussed. And I was listening to an interview with Rem Koolhaas from OMA, and I really liked it that when he got asked, do you think architects are influential in the society? And he said, no, I don't think so. And I agree as well. I don't think that we are, because we don't talk about all the impact that our work could have on the society. And maybe if we did, we would have thought more about, hey, if I'm designing this multifamily, or if I'm designing this cultural space using this design strategy, for example, I will have to explain it to the wider audience why I'm doing this. So we would have questioned ourselves a little more.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm going to tell you two examples. I'm going to mention two examples right away that I'm going to steal from previous guests. And I'd love to have you comment on them. One was Pascal Sablon that I mentioned earlier. She talked about, I can't remember the neighborhood, but it was a neighborhood in New York. I think it was in the Bronx. And the bridges were consciously designed to be too low to allow a bus to come in and out of this neighborhood, right? And it was a way of isolating the neighborhood. And basically, it was a black community, and they didn't want the people in that community to leave that community and go out into white community. And one of the methodologies they used was to make it such that they couldn't have buses going into that community. It was a forced isolation, like absolutely shitty thing to do, but it was in a place where they used urban planning to consciously isolate from the community. And then I'll throw another one at you that came up yesterday that I thought is a complete opposite direction. It was Elena Pinkley from the American Coalition for, Education Environments. And they talked about how there's a big trend in urban settings, especially in, marginalized communities, to have schools be built in conjunction with community centers and gymnasiums and grocery stores and things like that for the purpose of one-stop shopping. So if you have to get on a bus to move about within your community, use public transit to move without your community, you only have to go to one block instead of having to go here and here and here and here, which creates barriers to people living, a full life. So, you have two extremes, one where it's very inclusive and one where it's very consciously, with a darkness in your soul, isolating people from the rest of the world. Could you speak to those sorts of examples in terms of how they change power and equitable outcomes?
Exactly. That's two different, very interesting strategies. Obviously, as architects, you can control behavior, you can control performance, and that is somehow political power. In both of the examples, we can see that there was an intention behind those type of design interventions. And perhaps what I see, what I feel, what I hear is that maybe minorities would be, and I'm not saying that they were necessarily minorities, but minorities would perhaps, because they have this, somehow they would question the system, for any type of, they would question the way the neighborhood is being run or being performed. So they have this type of opposition, they have this question. They are perhaps more particular and more conscious about, hey, we need to create these changes to be able to have our voice or have a dialogue, or create a change. I think this understanding, this necessity for creating change is something that we should all feel and we should all educate ourselves, but perhaps minorities would feel this urge to create a change more than other people. We have the example of African Americans, in that neighborhood, migrants, or different types of, maybe female architects might have a different language of creating some sort of awareness that, look, these are the rights of women for us. And so I think these are really interesting approaches that you can do that. And what I would love to do is not necessarily to make or enforce people to perform in a certain way. What I would love to do is to create this, just pose or propose this question of, hey, this is the situation. What do you think? Why do you think it's happened? Because the way politicians would look at, in an example, is very different from the way people would look at it. And we need this dialogue between people and politicians. Otherwise, we won't be able to create a change. Regardless of how much we say that we are against a certain trend design, I don't think they would understand necessarily, or they would agree. But I think what we need to do is to propose a question and then make people think and wonder and ask, and hey, maybe then there's a need for having a conversation, between us.
Right on. Okay.
Forget the old paradigm that privacy means darkness. With Solera translucent glazings, architects can design spaces that are private, filled with natural light, and visually stunning. It's time to rethink how buildings work and feel. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
I want to switch gears again because there was a couple of things I wanted to make sure we covered. And the other one is mindfulness in architecture. You talked about the connection and, I've had a few guests talk about that, but I want to hear your opinions on this. Can you share your ideas on how we can design spaces and maybe communities too that allow us to be more present in our own lives?
A good question. I think the whole idea of mindfulness, I think I've explained this to you in a few places, but it came to me after my spiritual transformation, my spiritual journey, and after really watching the impact of mindfulness in my own life. As architects particularly, we could have a very robotic type of lifestyle, sitting in front of a computer and just doing everyday type of task. But for me, the whole practice of movement was really important. And this type of conscious movement and this connection between the mind and the body was very important when I was talking about mindfulness. So as an architect, I was very keen to create these opportunities for people to be able to pause and connect the mind and the body. So it could start from designing the layout of the house in a way that there are lots of pauses and there's a lot of, for example, transition and turns around the house which makes pause in certain spots in the layout, for example. Or it could be mindfulness about creating a mindful public space where all the sensories such as sound and sense of taste or texture and all of these tactilities would help you to pause and somehow clean up, refresh your system. Like the sound of water, the very different types of tactilities that you can create with different materials. So I think this is all about encouraging people to pause and be more aware of where they are. I'm here. Let's connect the mind and the body and just, have a different experience. Rinse whatever's happened, this morning. This is my lunch break. Let's just continue on fresh. So that type of mentality.
Right. Okay, we're running out of time, but I want to ask you this question anyway, just for fun. How different is architecture in Melbourne compared to America? Are there really consequential differences? Or?
A very good question. Look, we have amazing practices in Melbourne and also in Sydney because I've practiced in both cities. I think what I like about firms in Australia perhaps is that we focus a lot on design, and I was a design firm as well, which is great. However, I think what I've really noticed after moving to the US and also prior to that, when I was practicing with these firms internationally, was that the level of precision and detailing in the actual process of putting the drawing sets together. The other thing is that, for example, practicing in New York, there are a lot of building codes and regulations, right, which could be a little, challenging in meeting the requirements. However, all of these restrictions will give you a very concise and very firm and precise type of vision. So you have to be really careful about crafting the drawing set in a way that it's just, is perfect or close to perfection.
Right.
We didn't have necessarily this in Australia. I think that's the main difference that I can see. However, there are less opportunities in design, for example, in a city like New York, because, there are a lot of, it's all about preservation or, we have adaptive reuse type of phenomenon. I worked in other states as well. I think I see that difference. We also talked about urban design and planning. We have a very good urban design and planning, perhaps because our cities are younger compared to American cities in Australia. So it is architecture and urban design and planning are very much intertwined.
Yeah.
Here, to be honest, I haven't been, like the projects that I've been involved with, haven't been at urban scale. They have been at urban scale, but I wasn't involved in urban design. I haven't seen that much type of integration between the two. I think that's where I see the difference. But the other thing is that, what I loved and I really enjoy practicing in the US is that how much support people provide for each other. I was very lucky to have a lot of support when I moved without even having, I obviously knew people practicing here, but, they're very welcoming to new architects, and that's very positive, very welcoming, very helpful, very generous with their times. The number of people who offered to just have a chat with me about, the strategies that I can take after moving were incredible. And I'm very grateful. So yeah, I think I've been really seeing the difference in terms of how you really need to tailor your skills, and particularly when it comes to construction documentation and, all the details and construction administration, I see a big difference that there's a lot of focus and there's a lot of refinement happening in the US.
Okay, it's time for the $1 million question. Every episode, every guest, I've asked this question, and I ask people to answer it from whatever perspective they like. What makes a great building?
Yeah, again, a very good question. We talked about it, I think, briefly. You brought up this question. I think if you asked me 5 years ago, I would have said that good design would make a perfect building. I still believe in design. I still believe that the effort that you put in, the time and effort that you put in to design for a good design will pay off at the end. So there will be way less time wasted on documentation and in construction administration because you have mastered the design, so there will be less requirements for modification. However, I think after just working and having a lot of adventurous type of experiences with different firms at different levels, I think I've really brought down my standards to the very minimum of, if I see a good drawing set with, all perfect type of, standards and graphics, I find that a good design, a good project, let's put it this way. Or if I see that someone has met all the code requirements and they're compliant, I would still say that's a good project. My expectations are that low, unfortunately, because I've had a few not very amazing experiences. However, looking at the ideal world, I think obviously good design, and I'm now into the whole idea of regenerative design, which is really the next level to sustainability. And because I always had this interest in technology, in AI, but also now in the technology of composite materials and bio-based type of materials, I think regenerative design is, I find that just finding strategies to make a building like a living system that ages through time and breathes through time, similar to human being, I think it's the perfect scenario because it becomes a healthy environment for people to live in, and it ages well. And that, it also promotes health and well-being to other people. It encourages that to other people. And it's also, safer for the planet as well.
Wonderful. All right, before we go, is there anything you'd like to share? Any big announcements, anything exciting that's coming up that you want people to know about?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think very exciting news was, my recent decision about taking on this, at the moment, associate principal opportunity in Minneapolis, which is very exciting. Obviously, we're waiting because the firm is in transition and it's been relatively a long wait until I officially start. But I think that's the very exciting type of news because when I moved, I worked in different roles. In leadership roles, but also as a consultant through my own company. I was just waiting for an opportunity to be able to, lead an office, but also opportunities to expand back in Australia, which is thankfully possible, hopefully in the near future with the current firm. The owners are very progressive and they're very willing to expand, including in Australia. So that is something for me to be very positive about because I can also work through my own baby motion studio, which is very exciting.
Wonderful. What a great conversation. Isun, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It was very insightful and I really appreciate having me in your podcast.
Of course. You take care.
Thank you. You too.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.